Let's get started. 7:02 on July 30th, 2024. This is meeting at the 2229 Main Street Advisory Task Force. Let me start by calling the roll. Rich Feely.
Here.
David Ropeek.
Here.
Gary Kleiman.
Here.
Court Booth.
Here.
Carl Seidman.
Here.
Great. I think Kurt Herman and Pam Hill have said they cannot attend. And let me just talk about Carrie Flood. So Carrie has been getting medical treatment, and I spoke with her, and she prefers to suspend her activities on the task force. She just has to attend to her health and her family, and so we had a conversation on that. So she won't be participating in the task force activities, and I think we all wish her well, and we probably ought to do that individually or collectively, formally. She's a battler. She's been so valuable to the whole town with all of our activities. She'll be missed. I have approached Terry Ackerman and in turn Mary Harmon of appointing Pam Rockwell as a full member. Pam has been very active and has been writing. I think Pam Rockwell is agreeable to that. Pam has a little touch of COVID revisited, so she won't be on the call tonight, but that's the intention. So I think, as far as I know, the select board will be appointing her on August 5th. So I think she will be a full voting member. Pam Rockwell will be at the as of the next meeting. So that's sort of an update on logistics.
Well, Paul, it's going to happen, but it might be a little later because we have several steps. We have to do the nomination step, and we have to do the approve step, and
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I was just reading the last emails. You guys know your business and
yeah.
pointing.
She'll be appointed, yeah.
Yeah, and it's quite appropriate because Pam has been a very active participant in a lot of the activities. So on the agenda for tonight, let me. Okay, we're going to go over the. Since I don't have the minutes, but we are going to go over. Hopefully, you've all reviewed the minutes. If you haven't, and I made a mistake by not including it in here, we will defer on that. But so has everybody read the minutes from July 16th?
Yes.
Paul, I left off the hour of adjournment because I failed to record it, and without the recording, I couldn't make an accurate guess as to when we adjourned.
Okay.
So we'll, if we are going to defer, then I'll get that added.
I think you're safe to just say 9 p.m. because I recall I had to go at 9 and it was a couple minutes after that, but
It was about that. Yeah. Okay.
I would just say 9 p.m.
Very good. And people always, and then we'll add the video link whenever it arrives for the official records.
So I
Yeah.
move that we accept the minutes of July 16th as amended with 9 p.m. as the closing hour.
Okay. Roll call vote. All in favor.
You need a second?
Second.
Did I have a second? Okay, we got one. Rich Feely. We're voting on approval of the minutes. Rich?
Aye. Oh, pardon. I just realized I wasn't here. I can't vote.
Well, you
That's
can technically, but you're
I
welcome
can, but
to
I shouldn't.
abstain.
Sorry.
Could do either. David Ropeek.
Aye.
Carl.
Aye.
Court.
Aye.
Gary.
Aye.
And Paul, I'm aye, and minutes are approved as amended. Excellent. So back to the agenda. We have two main things to do tonight. So thank you all for getting in those the matrix, the decision matrix results. And the purpose of that whole exercise was just to kind of get alignment on what we know and where where we may have some uncertainty or trepidation or, so when we move forward here into final deliberations and voting, I want to make sure that we have criteria that A, we have agreed on, B, we've met those criteria, or that the uncertainty is acceptable to proceed on a recommendation. And then I have proposed, taking the liberty of putting together some recommendation alternatives, just what that language may look like. And I want to kind of go through those to see if that we're covering all the possible types of recommendations. And there are probably a lot of permutations of those recommendations, but I think it'd be worthwhile talking what those might look like in their entirety. I want to talk a little bit about where we are in the report and progress, and talk about some of the logistics in writing and submitting the various chapters, and then we'll take public comment. Let me start by sharing. So what I have done recently, I've added, I think I have everything in here. Yes. Can you all see this? The matrix, it's in an Excel form.
We see it.
You make it a little larger.
Yeah, you could zoom and you won't lose any columns. Yep.
Okay, there you go. So what I think, and I've added, so Gary submitted a little late, but I've added in here. You all have, I think, all have the various pieces. So you all have the individual responses, and then Rich just recently responded with some suggestions, which we'll get to. But I think it'd be worthwhile just kind of walking through these questions and seeing if we have any discussion around any of them, or unknowns, or things that we want to talk about, and maybe what's missing here. So again, as we we've done with our research, and we're asking the question now, okay, can we proceed towards a recommendation? So we need to know some things. So first thing is the legal category, and this one is probably more complex than others, because as we know, there won't be certainty until there is. In other words, there won't be certainty until the actual negotiations. But what I want to get a sense of, do we know enough right now in our discussions with MENA, in discussions in the research that the group has done, in discussions with EPA and DOJ, do we have some sense of where we're headed right now? You could argue that every one of these is unknown because it isn't over till we negotiate, but I was heartened by the responses here. For example, in the first one, is the current status of site ownership known? It's an interesting one, because everybody said yes, or likely it's known, but there are some uncertainties, right? The role of the officers, it's a defunct corporation, but the officers still are associated somehow with the property. So this is something town council has to resolve. So I think largely because of the title search, we do know about ownership. And any nuance or comments on that we need to keep
the nuance I'd offer is, yes, it's known, but that's not to imply it's as clear as it would be on any property any of us have ever encountered. So known, yes, but clear and obvious, no. Hence, the negotiations will be entirely through EPA.
Right.
Paul, I had a thought about it. This is a good point to raise, a general point that I wanted to make about the matrix, which again, I commend you for. Thank you. Helped with my thinking a lot. There are a lot of categories that I found. I was reasonably certain of the answer, but like you said, caveats, like we were just talking about. And I wonder whether in refining these things down, like we're doing with this conversation and will with a couple subsequent ones, and in the report, we can figure out some way of stating how certain we are. 80% certain, 90% certain. I don't want to get too quantitative, but we don't want to say 100% certain in a lot of cases, but we want to be reassuring to the select board about reasonable certainty in a lot of cases. I wonder whether there's some way of, even with the
David-
even with the votes and the X's in the matrix as a starting point, some way of establishing how certain we are.
David, based on your academic work, I'm sure you are familiar with this concept of expert elicitation. I mean,
Yeah.
essentially what Paul is doing is an expert elicitation, which does give you some degree of bounds of, right? I mean,
Yeah, well, it does. And look at all the X's, right? So we
Right.
could just use the matrix as the reference point for what I'm talking about. But to refine this down to get to where Paul is leading us to a vote, a decision, and all of that, and kind of the language that we're going to say in the report, expert elicitation then has to communicate that to the client, right? How certain we are and so forth. And just as we go through everything that follows, I'm calling us to think through how we state our degree of certainty.
No, that's a really important point, which is if we went back to the outline, and I don't want to go through that today, each of these sections has an uncertainty piece as opposed to one big uncertainty at the end. And I think as we go along, the degree, what are the uncertainties and what's the degree of confidence? And, it's more confidence than uncertainty. And, in my expert reports, so with a reasonable degree of certainty or a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, nothing is absolute, even in expert reports in litigation. So the language, we'll probably have to think about that. But I would say we have a reasonable degree of confidence in the answer to number one. I think you're right. Let's think about that language and think we have to talk about the uncertainties in each and every one of these items as we go through. But
A lot of reports have language like that: high degree, reasonable degree, moderate degree of certainty, those sorts of languages. It's good to keep in that frame of mind as we go, I think.
yeah, it's very subjective because it's not quantitative. So we'll go through some of these, which we probably have absolute certainty, but this one we don't have absolute certainty because of what court just talked about. There's some things we won't know until they're negotiated. So, but it's a very good thought to keep in mind here, New. It's a very good point. We'll have to communicate that in the select board, not in one big section, but as we go along, and we'll have to summarize that, and probably have to summarize what are the most important the most important uncertainties that the select board should keep in mind as they go forward. And maybe there's one or two, or maybe there's 10. So
I just echo Paul, not all of these are of equal importance in the town's decision to go ahead. Like this first one, I'm not sure how essential it is, since our negotiations are going to be with the federal government, and there are mechanisms to acquire the site that don't require a direct transfer from the owners. So even, it's not necessarily a critical issue for the decision.
right, it may be a critical decision for the actual acquisition down the road, but it's probably not a critical decision for our recommendation. I think something like that. The second one here, can the town seek and receive liability protections? So this is a legacy liability protections, and I think everybody said yes, and this is one of those things we have heard, we understand, we have read that those liability protections are available to towns and probably available to the town of Concord as well. So that's probably as far as we can go because, yes, they're available. Any thoughts on that one?
Paul, if I might.
Yeah.
Two notes. One, on the second item that we're dealing with now, some of the notes belong in the cell below the references to liens, number one. And then number two, just a general point about how these things sort out for known and unknown and importance. I want to share with you a related idea that Pam and I are working with and expect to ask Mina to really pay attention to is, in what order do we gain further certainty should the town seek acquisition? Another way of putting that is only by doing it in the right order would the select board start a process and then wisely be able to bail out if key priority considerations or benchmarks were not met. You know, we don't want to go down the road and knocking off the easy stuff and then have one stopper at the end, having spent many tens of thousands of dollars on legal.
I agree. I don't know how much that is sort of programming Mina's negotiation sequence. I don't know.
No, but I just want to share it with the group that we're thinking in those terms, that there's
Yeah.
got to be as orderly a process as possible, because it's not all going to happen at once. If acquisition is indeed where the select board go. That's all. Doesn't belong on this matrix, not suggesting
Yeah.
that, but it is related.
And I do apologize in transcribing this. I may have mixed up some of the notes in different places, but
No worries. It was a lot of work by a lot of people. I would echo David and say thank you.
okay. Okay, third one, has a title search been done and is the status of all liens and mortgages known? It's an interesting one. I think I think personally that's largely true, but I know that the Citizens Bank loan, we know that it's still out there. We don't know what the status of Citizens Bank mortgage is. We know it's on paper, but we don't have, so you could have, everybody said yes, but you could have answered sort of that, could have bifurcated that. I think on the federal side, we know what that is. On the private mortgage side, we know as much as we're going to, I guess, until we start negotiation.
Yeah, and to make it more interesting, it was a borrowing authority. We don't know what was borrowed against it. So it's anywhere from 0 to 9.7.
9.2.
9.2, thank you. Okay.
Plus accrued interest potentially.
No, that's true. Oh, that's true. And the federal liens keep growing as well. But we do know that on line 7, does task force believe that federal and state liens can be negotiated to the benefit of the town? I think there's sort of a mixed response to that. We do know that they're willing to sit down and negotiate with us. We don't know what favorable means, and we won't know until we have negotiations. But and those terms are unknown. So we know that there's a pathway, but we don't know what the end of that pathway would be. Is that a good way of stating that?
I think we also don't know what is the threshold for the town. You know, if EPA wrote down their lien to 25 million, would that be sufficient, or 5 million, or 0? I mean, you know, what's beneficial to the town? I mean, obviously 0 would be ideal, but what's the sort of threshold for which the town would be willing to pay to settle
Yeah.
that?
So I could have split that question in two. The first part, does the town believe that the liens can be negotiated? And then the second part, could they be negotiated to the benefit of the town? I think the first one would be yes. Second one probably would be unknown. So I think the mixed answer is probably appropriate there. Does the task force believe that private mortgages can be negotiated to the benefit of the town? I think that, I don't know who said yes, but we don't know. That's sort of, it's been unknown for a while. We don't have a clear line of sight on that yet. So I think we go into any report basically having to state that we know what it says on paper. There haven't been any further discussions, and those discussions will be forthcoming. Yeah, as you go through this, you ask yourself, are any of these sort of stoppers? Would that cause us to take an off ramp? We'll have to talk about that later on, because we're not sort of deliberating on that issue quite yet. Line 9, are there
Well,
no?
can I just say something quickly?
Yes.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. We don't know. But in the real world, I think Citizens Bank would love to get rid of this thing and get it off its books in any form. I mean, nobody wants to own something like this, I think, particularly if it means acquiring the EPA liability. So, I mean, we don't know, but I would be optimistic that the town can negotiate to its benefit. I think CB would be glad to wash its hands of it. Any bank would. So I don't know, maybe we don't want to say that, we just leave it that way. But to me, this is certainly not a barrier to commencing negotiations with EPA. Yeah, we got to talk to them, but I don't think it's on the critical path.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, obviously the EPA lien is, then the federal lien's the most important. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the most important, but it seems to be the clearest pathway to resolution, even though we don't know exactly what those terms are. Well, it'll be interesting, Court, and I know you started to write it, how we describe where we are with that Citizens Bank lien and the level of, back to David's point, the level of confidence or uncertainty, or however you describe where we are with that. I mean, Rich just described a certain confidence that it's probably not going to be a big stumbling block, but we just don't know that.
Mhm.
Number 9, are there known mechanisms to discuss and negotiate outstanding liens and mortgages? It's a little bit redundant, but I think I think MENA is in that box. The mechanism is for town council to negotiate with those parties. So I don't know whose note that was, but that's exactly true. Not sure of the details of the process, but EPA seems open to it. And whether EPA is part of the negotiation on the private mortgages or not remains to be seen. I know MENA seemed to intimate that that was very part of the discussion. We'll see. And stop. I don't want to go too fast on these, but I want to get through them. So stop me if you have any comments here. Other acquisition pathways available to the town? Yes, I don't think the pathway has been selected. Yes, somebody had the comment eminent domain seems most viable. I think that has been discussed. It may not turn out to be the right one, but that seems to be that seems to be the likely pathway right now. But I don't think we can say any more than that, other than there are pathways. And there's several. We know there's several. Can acquisition terms be negotiated to the benefit of the town? This is another. We think so, but we don't know until it's done. That's what negotiations are for, as Gary added most recently. It is likely the federal lien can be reduced or completely eliminated, but the terms are unknown, and yeah. But from everything we've heard, I think there's a good chance that they can be negotiated to the benefit of the town. But there's some uncertainty in that statement. We won't know till actually the negotiation. There are negotiations. So a number of these sort of have the same theme, right? Can the town obtain satisfactory ownership liability protections through insurance? So this is a kind of split decision on this. There were some that, based on our previous conversations and conversations that Chris has had and is having, that is yes, but we don't know that for yet. Anybody want to say anything more about insurance protection?
I think it's good that we have mixed opinions on this. I think that Chris is going to give us assurances about what the town can purchase, but the operative word here is satisfactory. What might be satisfactory today might not be satisfactory after a claim. So this is uncertain risk management, to be sure.
And the details of the policy and what's included and what's excluded, become important to making that judgment.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that the town can get insurance for this site, but what the terms are and what the coverage is unknown, uncertain.
Yeah. Should we be clear that basically protection for the, for the, historic liabilities has got to come out of the negotiations? No insurer is going to sell us liability protection for something that got there through NMI.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And Chris is very much on top of this and knows that this would be protection for the town against town action or inaction subsequent to acquiring that had nothing to do with prior use.
This is future liability.
Yeah. I don't know, Rich, you were in the Maritimes when I think the letter in the bridge came out, where I kind of explained the two-part liability issues. One is the sort of legacy liabilities that we get protection through mechanisms that EPA and bona fide purchaser protections, and then the future liabilities for us as an owner, things that we do to the site, the things that the owner, the others have done to the site in the past is not going to be covered by the insurance policy. It's going to be covered by liability protections. Could there be an intermingling of the two? Could there be a claim down the road that intermingles the two? Yes, but then we'd have to demonstrate, and potentially EPA would help us to demonstrate, separate those two, because 20 years down the road there could be some claim, but we'd have to figure out which bucket that falls in.
Yeah, I mean, the big uncertainty to me is if we acquired it, violated a, institutional control, and something got where it shouldn't be.
Yes.
I think that's the one that's really contested. If the DPW spills fuel oil, we'll get that kind of insurance.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. I mean, those are actions by the owner. If we upset the remediation system to the point where it releases contamination, not just a little bump on a wellhead, but
Yeah.
if we excavate an area we're not supposed to, don't get permission, we spread stuff all over the place, or a developer does so. That's why in that whole issue of institutional control management, we have to make sure that that eventuality doesn't happen, that it's managed quite tightly. Okay. So this was kind of an interesting question. Are there any negative impacts of failed negotiation, or negotiations themselves too risky? Any thoughts on this? We sort of had a definite split decision. So let's say we enter negotiations and the negotiations fail. In other words, the select board we make a recommendation to the select board to move down the pathway towards acquisition. The negotiations fail along the way. Then the select board decides, okay, we can't proceed. That's a definition of failed negotiation. There may be others.
Well, I haven't voted yet, but I don't see any downside other than the money spent on lawyers and planning consultants. I mean, if the negotiation blows up, then EPA is left with the site and they may try and put it somewhere else. I mean, but I don't see how we damage or affect what goes on going forward by entering into a negotiation. If EPA winds up negotiating with the private sector, well, if we decline to negotiate, they could have done that anyway.
The two questions in the box are separate to my mind. Are the negotiations themselves too risky? No. If we think them through and do them in the order the court was talking about and so forth, they're not too risky to embark in. But there are significant risks in my mind if they don't succeed to the town.
That's
An
different.
an orphan site, for example. So the EPA wants to get rid of it en masse. I said this at our previous meeting. Pardon my being redundant. The EPA wants to get rid of it, not piece by piece, right? But the whole thing all at once. There might not be a buyer for that. And if we don't, what the hell happens to this bunch of acreage? Does it sit there forever? And what are the implications of that? That's in my note. You could see it in the notes section. That's my comment, but I want to reiterate that is a real, in my mind, that's a real potential issue.
I mean, the other one is we'd lose the ability to have the asset for town use.
Oh, of course, that's the obvious one. Right. Yeah. Of course. Sorry.
I consider that a negative impact if
Yeah.
once the site for certain uses and negotiation fails.
Yeah, but that's kind of in the context of MCI and Peabody and all the town planning stuff too. So town use, as we found, is a potential for the site, but it's not like this is the only land in Concord that anything could go on. So that has a bearing on that consequence.
And I think, we're not at any negotiation table, but I think the fact that we are not yearning for this property it puts us in a good negotiation stance. If we were desperate for it, I think the parties with whom we negotiate would deal with us quite differently than if we're, let's call it, careful and ambivalent at this point.
So
Or undecided, maybe I should say.
I mean, I heard the comment, David. I'm just trying to figure out what the real risk. I mean, risk. I don't know. It's an open-ended word, but let's say the negotiations fail and the town passes, and it sits there, and no private parties interested. It is a site that EPA is still responsible for. They have O&M. They have security on. I can envision certain risk of vandalism and other, but what's the real risk to the town? There's a lost opportunity, but is there real risk?
Yeah, no, I agree that if it sits there as an abandoned site, that is not a, oh my God, risk. That's going to inure to the property values around it probably over time, I could imagine. I'm just, very crudely envisioning this thing sitting there for years and years and years and rust growing on the fence. And the properties all around it being affected by it potentially. I drove past it the other day. I said this in our previous meeting. I drove past it the other day and I visioned, oh my God, 20 years from now, if it still looks like this.
Yeah. I think another potential risk is that if the town negotiations fail and a private party acquires the site, will they be as good a steward of the site as the town might be in terms of managing institutional controls, or they may acquire the site, go into bankruptcy, and we end up, with a site that, is not being managed well, given the institutional controls. So, I mean, there is some risk.
Well, I think for me, that may be a real, well, first of all, it's undesirable for the town, for the property to just sit there and nothing happened to it. It's just undesirable to have 46 acres that are fenced off. But I think the risk of a private owner, and we have to articulate what controls we have through zoning. If there's a risk that something could be developed there that we don't like, but we don't have enough control to stop it. I'm sure that's not a hazardous waste disposal site, but it could be a very dense housing development. I don't know. I mean, so there's some private ownership has, I guess, pluses and minuses, but I don't know. It's something to think about. I'm not gonna.
But that's not a reason not to go into negotiations. I mean, even if the negotiations fail, you've still got zoning. Right?
Yeah, but, you know, zoning is only gonna control so far what you can do there.
Yeah,
But the point is, it's not risky to engage in the negotiations.
yeah, exactly. David.
Right.
Correct. Okay. So moving on, so the wrapping up of the legal uncertainty is known, understood, and manageable. So everybody said yes.
And
this
Pam,
point-
Pam and I threw a big caveat in there, which you'll see in the comments.
The uncertainty, you're saying the uncertainties can't be extinguished?
My point is, I'm not trained in the law, but I know that many an attorney would answer, it depends, quote unquote. Meaning that we can't predict the future with 100% certainty. So we would simply caution against being overconfident. That's all. Just be cautious, be careful.
Yeah.
Legalese fine print is always welcome.
Yeah.
The unknown unknowns you're referring to here.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, yeah, but we do, I think we do know enough to understand if we should proceed or not. So not
Yeah,
how to proceed.
I would agree, and that even might suggest, Paul, that this would be in that category of stopper. If the majority said no, they're not manageable. We would say, what are the other courses of action open to us or EPA? But we do see this high level of certainty with the necessary caveat.
Okay. Good conversation. It's, you know, that's the toughest category. So, needs and uses are the significant town and community needs for this land that are known and can be satisfied by the acquisition. So, I thought this was going to be all yes, but wasn't all yes. Maybe the significant, I think whoever voted no may have blocked the significant adjective.
That was me.
What's that?
That was me, based on the feedback that our research has shown us about how eager town people are and the various ways to use parts of it. The solar people were eager and the rest of it didn't strike me as significant. That's why I added that caveat.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm only concerned about that because if you view housing as a municipal function, which it arguably isn't, but could be encouraged if we acquired the site, that is a significant need in this town, and I think everybody would agree. So I was just worried by the use of not significant. I'd rather that we state the only, strongly state, well, I think there's a significant interest / need stated by both recreation and power and light. DPW was less so. The town really doesn't know if it wants it for offices. We know nobody wants it for public safety or schools. But I just don't want to diminish, indicate that we don't think that there's significant need either for the power, recreation, or housing.
Yeah, I think we'd be hard pressed to find a lot of people in town that would say, putting aside the risk stigma issue, but that would say we don't have good ideas for 20 acres of land, right? And aside from the risk category, but literally are the known needs that can be satisfied by this acreage. It's not clear exactly what, but it's clear that there are those. Which leads into the next one. Are there any uses that are uniquely served by this property? I think it does to some extent depend on MCI, but I think the second note here I think is key. There, because of the proximity to ARC, and we've heard that, and I've talked to some people about, okay, putting aside the housing development thing, but a Blackbirds type of low impact housing that's associated with ARC, battery storage because of the location in town, open fields, unique natural resources. Those are kind of unique to this property. You could, I mean, nothing in MCI is a unique natural resource. I mean, you could argue it's right on the river. So, but there are some things that uniquely that'd be suitable for this property. And I think that was captured by most people here.
I would dispute the claim that there are some unique features of the MCI property. I mean, it is right on Route 2. It is right next to West Concord.
Oh, yeah.
It's right on the river. So that has unique factors, but I don't disagree. This has unique factors as well that have specific. I added that last comment. I think, grid storage, passive trails around the unique habitat, Minuteman Arc, and transportation, because all of those are unique to this site, 2229.
I don't know where the whole DPW relocations stands. I don't want to kind of debate that here, but I don't think anybody's taken that off the table at the site. I think it's not obvious.
No one's taking it off the table, but it's not unique to the site. The question here is about what's unique. What can go here and only here?
Correct. Have town departments expressed interest in using the site? I don't know whose comment that was about lukewarm, but look, you guys, Gary and Rich, you've talked to the town
Yeah,
department.
no, I mean, it depended on who you talked to at Power and Light. The operational people, I think, weren't thinking far enough ahead. People like Brian were very clear on, this is a great site for solar and for battery storage because of the substation.
And
So,
Dean was very clear about the site for solar. Yeah, I agree. But I think there were other people like Mimi Granger, who's economic development, and she's like, it's none of my business, but I think this is a great site for assisted living. It's not really, she's economic vitality, but
Yeah.
still, I think there was interest from several town departments, not necessarily in their department.
yeah, I mean, the interest from DPW was certainly lukewarm. It was, well, maybe if we have to, but, recreation somewhere on that, list of things that's in the report are some things that could go there.
Yeah.
And so therefore, I think we do have to say that there's significant interest from, in terms of housing, recreation, and, electricity
Yeah.
and transit, obviously, because this is clearly the place to put a stop on any Route 62 shuttle service.
Does the land provide flexible options in reuse and development? I think,
Yeah, oh,
Yes.
absolutely.
okay. Is there open space? And it's a bit of a loaded question. Is there open space and a natural resource the town would like to protect? I think that is true. I might have said unique natural resources because that is true. This one's kind of interesting. Does the potential availability of MCI Concord affect the recommendation of the task force? I think overwhelmingly the answer was no, which was kind of curious because MCI is out there as, I would call it competing property, but a property that has to be factored into the planning, but it probably would not affect the recommendation of the task force for the select board what to do next.
Yeah, I think it affects what goes on the site, but it doesn't affect the fact that we ought to start trying to negotiate to get it. If you get a lot of housing at MCI, then we ought to look at some of the other things at this site.
I'm thinking that MCI consideration and 2229 consideration are using somewhat different yardsticks.
Definitely. This is sort of this property is a question, should the town acquire it or not? It's not clear that is actually on the table for MCI Concord yet. the whole ownership issue. There are others that know more about that than I do, but that this is, anyway.
Well, would it be safe to say that the MCI property might have tremendous commercial opportunities, whereas we're not talking in those terms with 2229 as one significant distinction? I don't know. I'm not on the 2229. Sorry, I'm not on the MCI group.
Also,
Yeah,
I
I
mean-
mean, we can say from our interviews that the developers of mixed use development would be much more interested in MCI than they are in this.
Well, I would say that, even stronger was the distinction in commercial use. I think there's interest in commercial viability for that site. There's not interest in commercial or retail for 2229. But I
Right.
think there's interest in mixed use housing at both.
Yep.
To the point that's in the comments section, this is part of larger planning that is not our remit.
Yeah.
I went back to our charge to answer this question. Our charge is about the 229 site. Town planners factor that into everything else. We are charged with recommending whether to and how to go forward on the 2229 site. We are not the larger planners. We can talk about this stuff and that's great. And we can note, of course, we will in our report that the 2229 site for the select board will be in the context of larger planning, but our remit is just this site. I think we've talked about this one. I
Yeah,
recall
th-
a discussion that kind of led
So
to
if
that.
we're going to go down into details, I would argue, David, yes, potential availability of MCI affects, but what is our recommendation? Yes, there's one recommendation in our charge, whether to acquire or not, but there are other recommendations that are in our charge, right? What is in the business interest of the town and things like that. And I think it does affect, to some extent, what kind of recommendations for reuse we would put out there. And I think we've heard very clearly from select board, they don't want us to recommend a specific use. So that's why I kind of said, no, it doesn't affect us, because we're already going to give the select board an envelope of scenarios from which future planning that can include Kai's Road, MCI, Peabody, into, what ultimately goes on this site. So I think, the answer is pretty clear. No, it doesn't affect our recommendations, but if you delve into what our recommendations are, it kind of does affect our,
Of course they overlap. Of course
Yeah.
they do. Inextricably.
yeah.
Well, one example, let's talk about DPW. If MCI Concord didn't exist in the future and DPW had to move somewhere, I think that would put a greater weighting on this property. But now that MCI is an outlet for that possible recommendation. Now we don't have to, and we're asked not to specify that. But I mean, it doesn't have an effect on the recommendation for what the select board should do, but it would affect the recommendation of what to do on the site. But since we've been asked not to go down that path, I mean, it's an interesting thing. As you know, I have mixed views on what to do here. In fact, I've been asked by a select board member, "Hey, Paul, what would you recommend for the site?" And I said, "Wait a second, you guys have asked us not." No, I'm not asking you that, but what would you recommend? So you are interested in what we'd recommend? Well, yes and no. So, I think as we move forward here, we may, and Gary and Rich, we may want to talk about this. We have a little smorgasbord of menus, but is there an example? Does it hurt to give not a recommendation, but an example, given the unique aspects of this site? Could we dip our toe in the water and give an example of what, not a master plan, what a plan may look like? You don't have to answer that right now, but
I think it does go to the phrasing of the question. You phrased it as the recommendation, as though there is one and only one question that our committee was charged to answer: should acquire or not acquire. And I have sort of objected and continue to object to that framing, because I don't think that's really what we were asked in our charge. Yes, that's among the things, but I think that we can answer that question in terms of, here are the criteria when it would make sense, here are the criteria when it wouldn't make sense. And I think we were charged to answer a much broader range of questions and provide information and context to the select board so that
Yeah.
they feel comfortable moving forward with whatever they want to do.
Yeah, we were talking about two different types of recommendation. One is a recommendation, what the select board should do, and I was saying the recommendation for how to use the site, because we're in this, so, we'll return to that. But actually, in the next segment of the agenda, we you know, to your point, I've laid out multiple types of recommendations that, you know, we can kind of consider. Let's move on to 22. So Rich added this question, which wasn't in there. Does the outcome of the residents at Thoreau, the 40B site, affect the recommendation of the task force? Again, the recommendation being to, well,
It doesn't affect the recommendation to acquire. I think it affects the order of priority of things you might do at the site. I mean, I think potentially putting a fairly large housing development there makes more sense if you haven't already built 240 units right up the hill from it, both in terms of loads on, you know, infrastructure and everything else. But I mean, it's broader than just the 40B. It's also Peabody, and it's also the town's, you know, current assessment of its long-term office needs. All those are things that, you know, need to go into the final determination of what goes on the site. But I don't
Yeah.
think it gets in the way of saying you ought to try and acquire it.
I agree. This is not like, none of these properties are an alternative. Like, okay, we're gonna, you know, MCI Concord means that we don't have to even think about 2229. None of these, including residents Thoreau, are in that category. They may
Yeah, no, I
affect.
think it's just I mean, I think it goes in the text, but we say, you know, we're not, you know, here are feasible scenarios, which we will put in. We are not recommending anything specifically, and it will depend on the outcome of joint planning for all these sites, and which includes whether or not 240 units are built up the hill.
But this goes a little bit to, and I don't want to derail this conversation. I know, Paul, you want to get through this, but I mean, I do think that our recommendations can be yes or no, we acquire or don't acquire. But beyond that, like a recommendation could be the town ought to conduct, you know, as a next phase of planning for 2229 Main Street, it really ought to be a next phase of planning for MCI, Peabody, the 40B at Thoreau Hills, Keyes Road, and 2229 combined.
Yeah, yeah.
That could be a recommendation we as a committee make, not saying we know anything about the other sites, but just saying it affects what use ultimately the town would value at this site.
Right, I mean,
Hold off so this
Yeah.
recommendation until the next segment, but I think you're right. But I think nobody's saying at this point that a recommendation is bimodal, yes or no.
No, but I think we can say that Rich's addition here, it's a good question. I think
Yeah.
that's, and you know, it does raise a question. Should we also have a question rather than just residences at Thoreau? Should it be residences at Thoreau, comma, outcome of Peabody and Keyes Road? Like they're all elephants in the room that should be included in this somehow.
Yeah, I mean,
Well-
does the existence of other properties affect our recommendation?
I definitely, I mean, I would say that it will affect what planning, how the town plans for the future use of the site. And that should be something we address in our recommendation.
Right, it is. It's the next stage. It affects how we plan and how we use the site, not whether we enter that phase of planning. Yes.
Paul, I'd like to just emphasize one other thing, which is implicit in all of this, and I think we all know it, but I think it's important to say it, and that is that value of the property is all about potential use for any of the properties we're talking about, except this one. This one is potential use and who would the town like to have managing institutional controls, given the history of this site. That's what makes this one unique, is we have that added question. Who do we want owning the IC responsibility? Which is my shorthand for, do we want to divest responsibility to a third party or not?
Well, that's interesting. It's sort of back to the question of the risks in failed negotiations, sort of the next layer down. Is there a risk in delegating management of those activities to a private party? Are there risks of private ownership? I think that probably is probably an adjunct question to that whole thing of failed negotiations.
And earlier tonight, it was implied that yes, it is riskier to have an unknown party pick up that responsibility. Now, have we proven that? No. Is it necessarily true? No. But that was certainly the clear inference.
Yeah.
It's a possibility that.
Yeah, and look, the task, the sense of the task force is a good yardstick as well. Like, if we all have the sort of the same sense, that is not a preferred option for various reasons. So that I should have probably added that line, and maybe I will. And when I send this out final, I'll do the same thing I added to line 22 here. I won't put in any X's, but I'll just add that as a criterion. Health risks. This one was fairly straightforward. I think between Rue and our task force, we've probably done a good job in designing how that is approached. So have the human health risks related to post-remediation exposures been researched? Yes, that's the Rue report. Are the risks known and acceptable with a reasonable degree of confidence? I think the answer is yes, except of the fact that Rue is producing a post-remediation risk assessment. I think, Court, that was you and Pam's note. That is true, but why does that make? Is that unknown because we don't know what to remediate? I don't understand the unknown categories.
Simply that the assessment is a post-remediation and we haven't arrived there. That's all.
Yeah.
It's a declaration about a future state.
Yeah, okay. True.
Will those risks preclude use of the substantial portions of the land? I think no. There's one unknown there. And maybe substantial was an inappropriate adjective, but I think there's other than the holding basin and sort of some of the no-go institutional controls yet to be determined, I think this land could be used for just about anything. We'll talk a little bit later about the septic system because that was an interesting conversation. It's not in this category, but it's in the in sort of the use of the land, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Is there a high level of confidence that the remediation goals will be met by EPA? So yeah, David, here I've added the sort of the phrase high level of confidence that the remediation goals will be met. And I did that deliberately because I know this is a concern. And yet everybody said, yeah, there's a high level of confidence that they will be met. Any worries or thoughts about that? Okay. Is there ample conservatism?
Let me just add one comment, and this goes not to the X's or O's in the X's in the matrix, but in our report, and this is reiterating something I've said a couple of times before, because it's a question I've gotten from some neighbors and friends. How do we know the EPA is going to make good on its promises? In our report, we talk about the legal mechanisms that bind them to meeting those standards. That's been reassuring to me, to others of us in the conversation. They say they're going to do stuff, people doubt them, but there are legal requirements. That increases our confidence that they will. Noting
that's-
that worthwhile.
I think that's one part, but as you know, EPA continues to produce data as they remediate and they show progress and they show that they're meeting those goals. I think that that is a really very helpful. That's very helpful that as they go along, they're showing the various areas where they've met the goals. And the SWARU that they have to produce, that document will indicate that they met those goals. So it's not only the obligation, you know, they have to prove that they've met those goals, and I think they will. And I would venture to say that an acquisition decision would probably depend on that SWARU, whether it would be conditional on that, whether it would have to wait for that. You know, we have to talk about the timing of that, but I think there are mechanisms to assure the public and to assure ourselves that those remediation goals are going to be met.
And noting those in the report, I think would be a wise idea.
Absolutely.
Paul,
Yes.
would it be appropriate on this one, more than a courtesy, to reference the fact that the oversight committee is still active? Because this is in fact why they're active, am I right?
Yeah. You mean in the notes to this, or?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, yeah, I'll add, yeah, very good, line 27.
All this sort of fits here, and I almost hesitate to bring it up. But what about the scenario where something happens in November that essentially blows up the federal government, meaning that it is substantially downsized in both authority and funding? In that case, I mean, I have great confidence that EPA, properly funded and with the Maximus, will do what they say they're going to do. But is there a risk to the town of going into this negotiating and then discovering that the federal government can't deliver?
Rich, I think Pam would give you an emphatic yes to your concern. She's mentioned it a number of times, quite unprompted.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it needs to be a separate line in the matrix, but I think we've got to say it, you know, in the key assumptions, one of which is that EPA will run as it has been run in the past.
Yeah, you know, let me give you a bit of history. In the previous Trump administration, you know, there was a lot of worry about EPA, but as it turned out, the Superfund program became a very important priority for the Trump program. In fact, a lot of the guidance that you read about municipalities and the emphasis about closing these sites and turning those over to towns came from the Trump administration. So I think, yes, there is concern about this, but I think there's some history that politics doesn't doom the Superfund program.
My concern is that there may not be adults in the room.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear what Kara has to say. I see her
Yeah.
hand raised.
I will permit Kara to
Your
unmute
moderator's discretion.
and go on, because I'm sure this conversation affects it. Kara, do you want to?
Yes, thank you. So I think one thing that's really important to remember about this site and where it sits in the program is the consent decree is between the Department of Justice and the settling defendants. And so that consent decree is, I'm not going to say it's outside of EPA. That's not the right wording, but it's independent of congressional appropriations to EPA. So the work will continue at the site, even in the case of there being a disruption at the agency. This is my understanding, because of how the consent decree is structured between DOJ and the settling defendants.
Good point. Yeah, thank you for reminding us about that.
Yeah, that's important. I think we need to say that.
Then a couple of interesting comments that were raised here, and I think they're important. So, David, you have the public's concern. So this is in the risk category. Have the public's so up to this point, we've been talking about the task force. How do we feel about things? Are we set to make recommendations? but you want to talk about your insert here in 29, David?
Well, all I'm thinking is that in the context of our task force recommendation to move forward with negotiations toward potential acquisition, the people who still have concerns about Superfund and radiation and all those concerns are a reality that needs to be recognized as the select board decides whether to move forward or not and how. Right? You know, the process of actual acquisition and all of this and support or not is going to get more heated the more specific and concrete it moves towards. And while the safety concerns have been skirting around the surface, around the edges, they'll be louder the closer we get to acquisition. And the select board needs to account for that and be aware of that and include that in their thinking. That's why I added this line. That's all.
Yeah, and I think we have that explicitly in the report. I think we're basically saying, as part of the whole set of next steps, if indeed we recommend that the select board move forward, is to engage that risk communication process, because in the interim, in the time between the select board's expresses the intent to potentially acquire and the time they actually acquire, they're going to have to build up public support for that, and I think that's going to have to happen. That's actually a next step recommendation.
Yeah, it's in there, but if we recommend negotiations toward acquisition, that very step, I can imagine, would trigger people who are concerned about the safety of the site getting louder. So at the same time that at the same time as we begin the negotiation process or commit to that, the select board, they need to be thinking of this aspect of the issue actively at the same time. That's why. That's all.
Agree, and I think fortunately we have some pretty good investigation and some pretty good science to support that, and but. I agree. The next couple, I think, maybe are misplaced here, Rich. That maybe they should have been in the reuse section.
Yeah, what I wanted to do was I wanted, number one, to say, we did want to be very clear that we explicitly, addressed private sector demand, found that it existed, particularly in housing, maybe in recreation, and that they were not put off by the history of the site. I mean, that doesn't mean that they would move positively, but I think this select board needs to hear that, yes, there is private sector interest in this land, particularly for housing.
Okay.
And that, it does not appear that with the kind of risk assessment that we just got, that the private sector would be put off, that they have developed other similarly historically contaminated sites for housing.
Okay. Okay, so the final section, which is pretty interesting, this is the section where there was most quote unquote disagreement or most spread in our sort of opinions. Are the costs of ownership, estimable? I think we're trying, Carl and others are trying to come up with sort of the infrastructure part of that, but the overall cost of ownership, I'd say we're going to, yes, they are estimated. How accurate are those estimates? I'm not sure. Carl, any thoughts on?
I guess the question I have is, what is the actual acquisition cost going to be? Which is the cost of ownership. And that, I think, is going to be determined by negotiation. So it's hard to know what at this point, what that cost will be.
Yeah, got it. Oh, the cost of infrastructure development is I think for the most part, yes. We're going to try to do that. Can revenues be generated at the site? It's a wild card.
I mean, once again, it depends on the use. If
Yeah.
use for private housing, it will generate revenue. For other private use, it will generate tax revenue and other revenue, you know, fees for water and electricity and the like. But it's use dependent.
But I mean, I agree with the comment. It is use dependent, and I agree with that, but they are estimable. Like, I think we should go a little further in this direction and try to estimate the revenues based on, again, like we did with, you know, potential reuse,
I've
pick
done-
some scenarios.
I've done it for the scenarios we have.
Oh, you have?
That will be in the draft report.
Yeah, okay.
Carl, will there be a reference to the windfall provisions?
Right, but I've only estimated tax revenue. Obviously,
Okay,
I could put in a footnote that I'm not sure the EPA is going to require us to share tax revenue. That's all. I'm estimating not lease revenue, but tax revenue based on you know, assessed value for comparable properties.
got it.
Yeah, not, but yeah, maybe I should have a footnote about any lease revenue will be subject to an excess profits. Yeah.
The uncertainties in the future costs of reuse and ownership acceptable. Acceptable cannot be determined by the task force. This is true.
Well, you know, Kara's had her hand up for a while. I don't know if that's an old hand or whether she has another comment.
I think it's an old hand. Is it Karen?
Sorry. Yes, I'll take it down.
Can the management of ICs be defined in a plan to do so understood and acceptable? With the caveat that somebody noted here that the IC plan is not yet final. I think everybody believes rightly so that they can be defined and a plan to manage them be defined and acceptable to the town. We have to lay that out for the town. We promise to do that. And that's important.
A quick question, remind us, do we expect the 60% IC draft coming in sometime in the next 4 to 6 weeks?
I think that's what Kara told us last time, but
Okay.
it was at the end of, Kara, do the next iteration of the IC plan, is that?
So I was supposed to receive it tomorrow, and I was actually told today that it's going to get bumped out about 2 or 3 weeks. So
Okay.
hopefully by the end of August, I'll see something and then I can share it.
Thank you.
Sure.
And do you envision any kind of major changes? I mean, are there going to be more ICs, fewer ICs, or just, is it just more definition?
I think it's the last. I think it's just more definition and detail about the ICs that have been previously laid out.
Okay, got it. Thanks. Does the town prefer to own and control development of the site for municipal and other uses?
Paul, somehow my response here didn't get accurately recorded because I had this as unknown. Because
Oh, I'm sorry.
it seems to me this is a policy decision that hasn't really been debated and decided yet.
Correct. And a few of these questions are thrown in there because they, I was kind of curious what people thought about that. I'm going to QA this whole thing. It was a bit of a bear doing it, and before it goes final, and before we actually memorialize this, this is all draft. I bolded this one because I thought the response, either the question was misunderstood or the responses were off. Will the town be responsible and incur costs related to future monitoring of the site? Literally, the question was really, chemical monitoring. It was, monitoring the contamination at the site. I think others were a little bit more expansive in the definition of monitoring. But I don't know why there were so many, why there were a couple of yeses here.
A possible yes is that we'd be monitoring the ICs. Is the fence still intact, for example?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I answered yes here, and I thought it's maybe I saw this as, you know, we're gonna be engaged in, we're not gonna be just standing by letting the EPA monitor the site and not doing anything. We're gonna have some involvement with that process. We're gonna want to review what comes out of the ongoing monitoring reports. You know, we're not gonna be hands off, I guess is how I thought of this. Not that we're directly responsible for the monitoring wells and.
Yeah, well, it plays like it was not an artful phrasing, but example to establish and maintain BFPP status, the town in fact has to continue to look at the data, has to continue to understand what's going on at the site, and maybe that's just looking at the EPA's data, but we have to. There's a process for establishing and maintaining the BFPP status, and it isn't passive, it's very active.
Want to remind the group that the research that we did with other communities found that the costs to oversee the institutional controls, not actually run them and the wells and stuff, all were minor. So they were there, but not significant according to the few communities that we spoke to.
Okay. Of the obligation of the town as an owner versus EPA's obligation for O&M. No, and I think yes, those are separate and distinct obligations. Will the site accommodate an adequate septic system? So Carl and I and Megan and Melanie, health director, had a conversation. Carl, you want to come? And it really depends on intended uses. I think the conclusion was, yes, the site can accommodate a septic system, but where it goes and how big it is, and
I mean, there's a regulatory issue up to a certain size. I think it was 10,000 gallons per day, whatever. The town has approval authority. Once it goes over that threshold, you know, it's subject to state DEP review and approval. But, you know, the impression I got from that is, you know, the site's large enough, you could always bring in enough new soil to put in a septic system. It's certainly a cost factor. But, you know, and one of the advantages of moving forward with our intent to acquire would be, you know, as we've talked about before, the ability to engage with the Maximus and influence perhaps what happens with the location and type of soil that gets brought in. You know, maybe they could bring in soil suitable for a septic system and place that in a location where we want the septic system and save the town from having to pay that cost itself. But it doesn't seem like this site can't accommodate a septic system.
As Paul knows, I had a sort of coordinate question, which is the one that was raised at the public hearing. What about ground source heat pumps? Is that any problem? You know, particularly, do they need to go below 10 feet? And Gary and I discussed it a little bit, and we figured, well, if you can get below the frost line, you can just spread it out further. But if you look at the plans for Riverside Commons, that is a very complex system of piping and wells. And I didn't know whether that might be a problem with the 10-foot limit.
Well, you could go below 10 feet. It's not like you can't go below 10 feet. You just need to have a soil management plan for test for that soil, what you'll do with it, et cetera, that the EPA has to approve. So it's not like forbidden to go below 10.
I just think we need to say that so that nobody says, oh, you can't do this because you can't get faucet-free construction on it.
I also know most ground source heat pumps, you only need to go down to like 6 feet before you're not gonna freeze the pipe. So if you can, anyway, but you're right. It would still be a plan you probably would want to get EPA to sign off on, even if you're going to bury something 6 to 8 feet down.
Yeah. Well, also remember that until the ice seas are done, we won't know exactly where
We don't know where the restriction.
what that 10-foot limitation is and where it is and how expansive that is. So
all of this does speak to, I think, another recommendation what we should consider, which is that, you know, as part of the town's process of going forward towards acquisition, if we recommend that, is to really do some serious site planning along with the use. They actually, you know, it's a complicated site. There's a lot of infrastructure. There are going to be institutional controls affecting the site. You know, it's going to need considerable attention to the actual site planning to, you know how this will get worked out and what the cost will be.
Okay, so the final question here, which leads into the next segment, is our decision criteria met to a sufficient extent so as to enable the task force to make a recommendation to the select board. It seems like we all, or 6 out of 7 of us said yes. And maybe the unknown was as long as the recommendation only goes as far as taking next steps. So I think we're aligned on, you know, we can handle the uncertainties. We need to articulate those, but we can make a recommendation. We have to discuss that, and I want to then. It's a perfect segue into the next. Piece here, which I'm going to share again. And I want to spend only about 15 or 20 minutes on this because this is going to take a bit of conversation. This is really getting into, we're going to get into deliberations, which we have, you know, several meetings to take this up. And I want to introduce. So what could, this is certainly not the final list, and it may not be the list at all, but I just wanted to go through this to talk about where my thinking was based on all the conversations we've had and the discussions. That certainly the recommendation is not bimodal, it's not yes or no, and these are hypotheticals. For the record, these are we may not adapt any of these, but I'll say the first 2 are conditional acquisitions. So basically it's okay, select board, we know enough, and we suggest that the task force recommends that the select board proceed to take actions and steps towards a possible acquisition. That A, they express specific intent to acquire to EPA, and B, they direct town council to enter the negotiations. The second one is very similar, except the third part is along with expressing intent and directing council at about the same time that the select board begins specific development planning in parallel to estimate costs, that they don't delay and, you know, spend a couple of years. And so this development planning is certainly would be in parallel to the other planning. So the difference between 1 and 2 is the planning step as part of the conditional acquisition. The third one is recommend select board take actions, express interest, direct town council, approach. So, and this is like, I could characterize this by exploring the various development options. For example, approaching an EDA, Economic Development Agency, to manage the site development, to approach private party. So in other words, the planning isn't just a municipal planning. The planning is, okay, the town probably doesn't want to manage the development, but let's approach a development agency, maybe put out an RFP, maybe come up with a conceptual plan. So it's a little bit more C&D, or a little bit more deeper planning recommendation that goes along with a conditional acquisition. So 1, 2, and 3 are conditional acquisitions of various types, where we can mix and match those. And I'll go through these, then we can kind of discuss the whole thing. Number 4 is no decision and no action. Task force recommends that the select board takes no actions and defers any actions at all until the site is cleaned up and the SWARO is issued. So basically the select board just waits and waits until townwide planning is done. So in other words, town doesn't tell town council to enter negotiations because we got to wait to make sure that the SWARO is being issued and that our planning is well underway. We know what we're going to do with the site. So that's a deferred, it's a deferred action recommendation. Number 5 is directly the town start negotiation with an economic development agency to acquire the site. And, we town negotiate with them. That's been done at other sites, in Watertown and Fort Devens, I think. The model has been that a development agency really take that over, whether it's an existing development agency or a brand new one. Number 6 is don't acquire the site. We recommend that they take no actions and we just allow for private or governmental ownership. We basically pass. Number 7 is we take no actions, we allow for private ownership. So 6 and 7 are kind of the same. It's do not acquire, we just basically pass. We allow for private or government ownership. So anyway, I just kind of, there are probably others and there are probably different takes on this. Well, what are your thoughts on whether these are the types of recommendations that we should be considering?
Paul,
Yeah.
I've got a question on number 5. We know that's a possible future outcome, but does the town get a seat at that table?
Well, that's part of the negotiations. This is sort of.
But
Yeah.
do we have any authority to negotiate with?
So this is not my area of expertise. It's more Carl's. So basically the opportunity is out there and the town is saying, we could acquire this, or we could work with an economic, we could partner with somebody.
Okay.
It's a
I mean,
partnership.
The Economic Development Agency you could potentially partner with it is mass development at the state level. I mean, alternatively, the town could set up, a redevelopment authority or some other entity, but that would essentially, I mean, it would be controlled by the town. It would be an instrumentality of the town. It wouldn't be totally separate, from the town. If it took that second path of creating some sort of development authority to do this, it would have significant control over that. But so I think they are two very different ones, working with someone like mass development. You're going to shift some of the responsibility for that actually onto a body independent from the town, and you could certainly negotiate an arrangement. We'd have some role with it. I think the challenge with this one is it presupposes some type of reuse. Mass developments, and you wouldn't really set up a redevelopment authority unless you were intending to redevelop the property for some, fairly intensive development, whether it's housing or mixed use. So it presupposes, I think, a planning outcome at this point that the town hasn't reached. So
Yeah.
I think it's sort of
Which is
ahead of under 3.
Yeah, it's number 3. I kind of embodied that in number 3, that, this the town
Yeah.
moves to acquire, does the planning, presupposes some development, and then kind of develops or partners with an EDA to manage that development.
Excuse me, the communities, the two Superfund sites in Woburn, Industriaplex and the Wells G&H, and separately Pittsfield with GE, set up with a bunch of negotiation between all the interested parties and authority to oversee redevelopment uses. So the terms of who had what say and all of that, by those 3 examples, was negotiable. And everybody was at the table negotiating. Carl would know more about this than I, but those were 3 examples where they did this kind of thing and everybody got a seat at the table to talk about how much say who would have.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of private owners at this site, so it's that the interested parties here are really
More narrow.
the state, the town, and EPA. I'm not sure Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, you gotta remember, somebody needs to sit down with EPA and negotiate for so somebody has to take the lead in negotiation for the acquisition of the site, whether that, right? So I'm not sure that's done cleanly through number 5. It's done cleanly through 1, 2, and 3, and it's certainly, it's not it's not independent of number 4, 6, or 7 either. So I'm curious, Gary Kleiman, I know you and I have been back and forth on sort of acquisition, the form of acquisition recommendations for a while. Does this overall approach, does this feel more comfortable to you? Not that any of these are perfect, but does this feel like the type of recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, I know what I would vote for, but I guess I think giving the committee all of these choices is a good approach to begin the dialogue and talk with folks. I feel like, you've already, with the matrix, we've already, I think, gone a long way towards answering what I think the committee's sense is here, but it is hard without negotiations to, select one of these definitively. And I still am very uncomfortable saying we have to select definitively. I feel like, although I know the select board's mandate was give us a recommendation, I feel like that's their job to pick one of these options. I think our job is to write a report that gives them information about each of these 7 options. Why would you do 1? Why would you choose 2? Why would you choose 3? And we have so much information that we need to document that, put it in a report, and let them ultimately make the choice. But I understand our mandate says, give us a recommendation.
For better or worse, we're going to have to pick one of these or form another one. And
on that, I disagree. I don't think we have to, but I understand the rest of the committee wants to pick one of these, and that's fine. I'm happy to pick one, but I don't know.
Well, I think I don't know. I think if we ask our customer, and maybe I will invite Terry to weigh in on this when we're in the public comments. Does the select board want a recommendation, or do they want a menu and make their choice?
I think our mandate and our charge was to give them the information to make this decision. I think you've laid out the choices pretty well, and I think that's what they wanted. But anyway, we'll ask Terry.
I love our select board, but Gary, you and I have dealt with various select boards, and I think they need advice. I think they need specific advice, and they hired us to do all the research and come up with advice. If we tell them, you make the choice, they're going to look at us and say, what? But I don't know. That's well, let me just ask, is there anything missing on here? I mean, I think number 4 is a perfectly, it may not be preferred, but it's a perfectly viable option. And we basically say, hey, the site is undergoing cleanup, and there's no rush. Let's just wait. I'm sure EPA would not prefer that, but we could prefer just to wait and do nothing and let everything else in the town fall out. I think that would probably mean, if we did then defer and then finally make a decision, we then would start the negotiation and the planning in 2028, and it would take us another 3-4 years to launch anything. So it'll probably be into the early part of the next decade. So we'd be delaying, but we could do that.
I guess the challenge is decision making under uncertainty, right? And that's why Terry's nodding her head. Yeah, I want you to make the trip. There is uncertainty here, and so even if one is inclined to acquire the site or not acquire the site, you still have 3 or 4 different options for acquiring the site or not acquiring the site. And so we have to be more specific about under what conditions would you choose 1 versus 2 versus 3? Under
Yeah.
what conditions would you choose, versus 5? And, under what conditions would you do 4, 6, or 7?
So let me just, I don't want this meeting to, we're just, I want to just throw this out here to start getting our thinking along. We're going to spend the next few meetings kind of digging into details on exactly what you're talking about, Gary, here. So I don't want to debate the goodness or the inadequacies of these. I just wanted to throw these out as.
Well,
Yeah.
I have a question on, is there a 6 and 7? I mean, if we don't acquire, can we limit the reuse to only private ownership? It seems like, I'm not sure how we end up with 7 instead of 6.
Because it's going to wind up being EPA's choice. If they can't find or
Yeah.
don't want a private developer, we can't stop them from still owning it.
Yeah, I think it's
Transferring it to the state or another federal agency.
I think those have to be folded. They're basically the same recommendation, I think, 6 and 7. Carol, what do you think about
Just
that?
just a reminder, EPA does not own the site right now, nor has any intention to ever purchase the site. It is not something that the agency does, is to acquire property.
Right, but if no party was interested and was out there, some governmental entity could acquire it, right? Could use it. I don't know how that would be done, but it doesn't have to be private or municipal. Could be.
I think what she's saying is it would sit vacant. So
Or would it get put out to bid by the federal government, by DOJ, or would someone put it out to bid?
No, it'll sit vacant. Will be the future of the site.
Okay, well, let me take this off of sharing if I can. And I'll invite Terry, who has her hand raised since we've used the select board's name many times tonight.
To your earlier discussion, wondering if for each of those 7 or however many you end up with, maybe you would list pros and cons. For example, the Economic Development Agency, what would be the pros and cons of that? And then that kind of leads into what you're, out of those 7, what are you recommending?
Yeah.
So that way you kind of have both, that we have all the information that led up to your recommendation.
In fact, if I would show you the outline, which I can't find easily, I don't want to interrupt. We actually, there's a section which has recommendation alternatives, and there are pros and cons for each one of those.
Yeah, perfect.
It's in the conceptually it's in the outline already, that we go through the various options that we've considered, and before we offer our final recommendation.
Yeah, that's great.
Are we I thought tonight's discussion was very helpful. It kind of got a lot of issues out there, and we're sort of entering the next few meetings where hopefully we'll have everybody on board, and we'll be discussing what a recommendation might look like, or whether indeed even we make a recommendation, to Gary's point. So but I think we're on track to that deliberation. As far as the report writing, so I don't know where everybody is, and I don't want to ask everybody, but we have to start writing it. And as your sections are drafted, if you could send those sections to Chris, Carmody, and myself, and nobody else, and we'll go through sort of the first review before we put together a draft for everybody to take a look at and make that a public document. I'm going to go through kind of the raw information just to make sure structurally we're in alignment. And I still have yet to engage with Matt at Skio to figure out how they're gonna help. But just, as far as the, and Pam Rockwell has already done this with the institutional control management section, which I know Carl's commented on. So I will be compiling the sections. We'll be getting back out to you with comments, and then the next iteration we'll all start commenting on these sections. But before we put a draft out there, which will become a public document, I want to make sure that the pieces make sense. Put it that way. Thoughts, comments, anything else?
Well, just to recap the exercise earlier, I think implicit in our discussion was the fact that even though we didn't line up perfectly, we didn't have variance that was alarming or confusing. I think it was a pretty reassuring exercise.
Yeah, I think what I did too. One person sort of, I think the level of certainty was depicted ranging from the yes to the unknown. I mean, you didn't have a lot of questions whether there were yeses, nos, and unknowns. It was either yes or unknown. There were a few that maybe because of the wording, elicited sort of an across the board response. I will take that matrix and edit it, make sure all your comments are compiled properly, and put that out there in the meeting packet for the next meeting for us to kind of say, okay, because I'll make that a public document at that point. There's just too many moving parts and pieces at this point. And honestly, I haven't figured out how to PDF a spreadsheet that has multiple sheets. There must be a way to do that. I kept trying, it just got the one sheet. I'm sure there's a way to do it. Shows my Excel talents are very limited. So our next, any other questions, comments? Our next meeting is not until August 20th, is that correct?
20th, yeah.
20th. That'll also be a Zoom call, and we'll continue the discussions about recommendations, the form of recommendations, and then probably when we get together in person in early September, we'll start doing straw man, and hopefully our writing. So remember, review the writing schedule, which I put out there, so we can aim towards the end of October. Any final thoughts, comments before we adjourn? Any other public comments for anybody else who's on the call? Okay. The meeting is adjourned. Great meeting, guys.